Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Friday, March 28th, 2025. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
And social commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
So there are penumbras and emanations from the Republican Party of trouble. The biggest, the most interesting is the withdrawal of the nomination of Representative Elise Stefanik of New York from the ambassadorship at the United Nations. We are told happening because the GOP House leadership is so worried about the special election to replace Mike Waltz, now National Security Advisor, in Florida, that their own internal data in a poll taken by Tony Fabrizio, who was Trump's pollster and one of the leading Florida pollsters, shows the Democrat in the district in the race leading by 3 points in a seat that Waltz won by 9. And with the House majority at 1 or 2, they cannot afford to lose one more seat. And so Stefanik has taken the banner for her party and said she would stay in the House through the remainder of her term through 2026 to preserve the House majority. Now, this has occasioned a certain amount of counter-conspiracy thinking among those of us who are hawks and pro-Israel people and all of that, because she is, of course, one of the most resolute pro-Israel voices in the House, and a one-time colleague of Abe's at the Foundation for, Foreign Policy Initiative, when she was a younger, bright young thing out of Harvard. And now there is this, is this somehow part of the overall Tuckerite, Don Jr.ite, Vanceite effort to extirpate the neocons, so to speak, from the Trump world, and some of which we'll know when we find out whom they name to replace her, which camp gets the UN. So that's one data point. The other data point, which Christine alluded to yesterday, was the loss of a Republican loss of a special election in Pennsylvania in a state Senate seat, again in a Trump district. Special election, the Democrat beat the Republican, and not good polling for Trump this week. I mean, basically, he's at 43% approval, and he's underwater on the most important issues like the economy, like he's 16 points underwater or something like that. So while all of Washington is fixated on Signalgate and the national security implications and the scandals and what's going to happen and her head's going to roll and all of that, all of which seems to be a one-sided conversation, because the only people who are saying that heads are going to roll are Democrats and liberals with no into the administration. The administration clearly is not intending for heads to roll, and again might be part of a battle inside the administration on the part of the Vance Jr. Tucker wing to go at Mike Waltz in particular for not towing the restrainer line here. So, but the fact is that DOGE has moved fast. Everything's moved fast. There's been a lot of fast movement. There's a lot of stuff going on. And maybe it's starting to look chaotic to the American people. And maybe they're not seeing the results that they want to see, which is Trump focused like a laser beam on the economy. Or maybe the way that Trump is focusing on the economy, like the tariffs and other things, are not positives in the eyes of enough people to suggest that he deserves credit for the measures that he is willing to take, and the focus that he is willing to put on the most important issue to them, which is the economy and their own personal finances. Since, of course, as we said yesterday and the day before, if those tariffs go into place on automobiles, there will be an inflationary effect on the price of automobiles, and that is the largest single consumer good that any American buys. So,
It struck me. I was watching some clips from the Doge, Elon Musk and the Doge guys interview, Doge men, I guess I should say, the Doge
those
boys
bros.
talking to Brett Baer on Fox News, and it really struck me that there was part of their messaging that maybe isn't landing in the way they might think. Because if people are still feeling like the economy is either chaotic, uncertain, and they are still financially struggling, weekly reminder, working class people don't like tariffs. They never have. So people going out there and saying this will be good for you comes across not only as condescending, but it's also wrong. But when they were talking about the amount of money that DOGE is saving the American people, it's something like 800 some odd dollars per taxpayer. I suddenly recalled all those lectures we heard from the Biden administration about how inflation isn't that bad. And this is too soon to say that that's the messaging, inadvertent messaging of the Doge guys. But there was a little hint there. If I was thinking, if I'm struggling and still kind of going paycheck to paycheck, and I'm still worried about the price of groceries, and now I'm wondering if I'm going to be able to afford to repair or buy a new used car, that message doesn't help me. It seems out of touch, because I'm not seeing an $800 check in my mailbox tomorrow, however much I might still share the goals of a smaller government and less bureaucratic ways. So that 30,000 foot focus that they have right now on eliminating bureaucratic waste has to translate into something tangible for the American worker. And it's not going to be with tariffs. And I mean, perhaps with just rising economic waters, but that will take time. So those special elections, in a way, are an opportunity for voters in places that were strongly supportive of reelecting Trump to say, we don't like the direction things are going, even as his country's going in the right direction. Numbers are still quite high.
I think with regards to pulling Stefanik here, I think something less sinister is going on than a sort of shift in the ideological direction of the foreign policy team. I think this is another example of where you see the other side of an administration like Trump's that doesn't take care in advance when doing things. I mean, there were people that said, "Look, you don't want to keep pulling nominees from Congress because of this very potential." And now here we are. So I think it's more
And they
that.
have taken, it's worth pointing out, I believe the number is three. I think three House members became members of the Trump cabinet. Waltz, the labor secretary, whose name I keep forgetting, and a third, Collins, the Department of Veterans Affairs. I think there are three House members aside from Stefanik. So they had pulled four House members, and after the November election, the Republican majority was 5 or 6 or less. And the idea would be, well, okay, you can pull them from a seat that's a majority Trump seat because the special election will just go to Trump. But that's a bet you're
Well, and
making.
it's not, the polls are not showing that. I think that's
Right.
where Abe's absolutely right, that perhaps they assumed that that would be the way things work. But those are, I think, in a lot of those districts, those were previous Democratic voters who switched to Trump, and they're now unhappy with their choice and expressing that in some of the polling data. Although it's
Right.
obviously, that's,
Right. But it
I
was
say that.
reckless. Right. It's sort of politically reckless. You wouldn't do it if the Senate were 50-50. You would, of course, not pull senators into the cabinet. It's too dangerous to do that. If you're depending on where you are.
It looks like, by the way, looks like the third was supposed to be Gates.
Oh, okay, fair enough. Right, it's supposed to be Gates. Okay,
So
that
there's two House members in, but Gates
Right.
resigned.
Right. Okay. So there were, but they chose 4. So, and as I say, it was a kind of hubris to do that because anything can happen. Clearly, in the Waltz seat, something of the anything can happen variety appears to be happening. Either the candidate who was replacing Waltz, his name is Fox or something, is not good. I mean, Ron DeSantis is indicating that he is not a good candidate. though I think he has a personal feud with the guy. And then the polling is what the polling is. So I
Well, off-year elections are often bad for the administration, for a new administration, and so this is another thing they should have seen coming, which is you have to price in the fact that there's often a snapback against the new administration, right?
Right.
We know that midterms often go against the administration, and there's a reason for that. But because of the buildup to that, for the same reason, the
Yeah.
off-year elections can do that too. Where Democrats struggled. I remember when Obama came into office in 2008, he rode this wave, and then the next year, the Democrats lost Virginia and they lost New Jersey governorships,
Right.
and they started freaking out. And so, and New Jersey, by the way, does this to Democrats every off year. It scares them in some way every off year.
Yeah.
So there's always it's like spotting the other team points. That off year election right away, and this happened with Republicans. The talented Mr. Ripley left the Republicans, expelled their talented Mr. Ripley from Congress in New York, lost that seat to a Democrat. I don't remember his name, but the guy who was sort of had this made up what?
Not Tom Suozzi. Was
No.
that
Tom Suozzi's the one who won the
right.
seat.
So you're referring to George Sanchez.
George Sanchez, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
and
it was like
Santos.
Santos.
And
that was something that Republicans were like, well, I guess it's so bad we have to, but that was another seat. That was a Republican seat. It went to a Democrat. Democrats probably going to be able to keep that seat as long as they keep a Tom Suozzi-like person in that. Whatever. The point is that this is, Republicans have been giving up seats and then losing the special elections behind them, which is really something they should have expected to happen a bit more and not assumed that they would hold a seat because it was theirs.
Well, the Florida congressional, I think it's the 6th congressional district seat. That is also another example of these risky special election moments, because this, I think, is much more a proxy war about Middle East policy. Because what we have is we have a Muslim Democrat who's very anti-Israel. He thinks there should be no American support for Israel, running against, I think Fine is the other guy's name, who should be Randy Fine, who's a state senator from Florida, who should be far ahead, but isn't. I mean, this is a red seat. So, but there, a lot of the battle is turning on Americans' support for Israel and the Palestinian issue, and that's become an interesting proxy war on that particular topic. So I think, and again, if the party is careful and cautious and learns from their mistakes here, they're going to have to shift course. But I think it goes back to Abe's broader point about them not thinking ahead and now reacting. It's a very reactionary administration in terms of what it's done or not done for the GOP.
I think that you have a reality distortion field problem, which is to say there's a lot of differing pieces of information, but then there is one mega piece of information. The differing pieces of information are this polling that is freaking Democrats out that says they're in their lowest position in relation to the public in half a century. The polling is all looking like they care about things that the public doesn't care about, or the public is actively repulsed by the things that they care about, and they have incredibly low numbers. And Republicans now in polling outnumber Democrats for the first time in almost a century, and all of that. So that's like the bad data for Democrats. But the data, not data, but the actual results, the electoral results in the United States showed Trump winning by 1.5 points. Now, he won all the swing states, but he won by 1.5 points. And the Republican brain trust is acting like he won by 20. And they are making moves, fast, radical moves in Washington, like it was 1981 and the incumbent president had been defeated by a 10-point margin and had lost 40 states. And the rubber is meeting the road. They did not have a mandate to do some of the stuff that we love that they're doing. They didn't have a mandate for. and Trump, because he wants to say, I want a victory like never before, and his entire, hypnotized band of, followers is walking around talking about how, this is the new, where this is for the next 100 years, we're going to dominate everything, and we're going to get rid of the rhinos, and we're going to get rid of the Democrats, and we're going to get rid of the federal workers, and we're going to do all this. And the referendum by 155 million people did not say that. It said, we don't want Kamala Harris, we don't like Joe Biden, Trump survived this, we're going with him, let's see what happens. And what we may have seen is a very serious overplaying of their hand. Maybe Democrats are foolish to be sort of like demonizing Elon Musk and seeming to try to make Elon Musk the target of everything, or maybe they know exactly what they're doing and that this is actually a very successful way of maneuvering into the present.
Well, I think the Democrats' disarray is part of the estimation on the administration's part. Part of the sort of hubris is that the Democrats look, completely disordered and chaotic within their own party right now. And so I think that's another thing that's making Republicans feel like, well, there's nothing standing in our way. Who's going to stop us? Chuck Schumer's going to stop us. And that if Democrats can find, one leader with a voice, right, it would turn around.
The Democratic Party right now, though, is in this interesting spot because what the only people trying to consistently share a vision for the Democratic Party are not politicians. It's this kind of Ezra Kleinish abundance agenda Democratic intellectuals who aren't extreme on most of the social issues, recognize the defeat that occurred in the last election, but also are completely I'm sorry, but utopian in their thinking about what can actually be accomplished, because everything they're complaining about not getting done is the result of the sort of insane administrative state and bureaucratic overregulation that Democrats themselves have long supported. But they do have this consistent message, which I think will resonate. It's the message that Abe has had far before Ezra Klein, coined it in his book. But why doesn't anything work? Nothing works. Why don't things work? That's actually, I think, where a lot of the American people are. And it's not a politically ideological position. So if the Democrats are smart, they'll get back in that lane. And whether or not they're actually capable of changing things, that sort of change looks different from what DOGE is doing. And I do think that's why Elon Musk calmly, with guys in suits, sat on Fox News last night and seemed very businesslike, because they recognize at some level that the smash and grab sort of move fast and break things is not really where the American people are right now.
Yeah, Musk. I just want to say, because I watched the at least the DOGE portion of the segment. Then Musk spoke one-on-one, which I didn't really watch. But what Musk was saying was, his message was, we're fixing servers. We're putting data that's floating around on paper into digitized form. We're making it more likely that people will get paid, not less likely. We're fixing systems. We're consolidating where there is excess, and so on. Yeah.
There is a long tradition dating back to the introduction of Robert McNamara into the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, of the idea that the way to make government work is to bring in highly disciplined business executives who can bring innovative business techniques created by the private sector, pull them in, apply them to government, and make them work. How is that? That is essentially how the administrative state that Christine mentioned was built, was sort of using, bizarrely enough, the principles that Robert McNamara used at the Ford Motor Company to start creating layers of bureaucracy inside the federal government that had not yet existed, that now, 3 generations later, have calcified into these structures that, if you listen to the DOGE bros last night, they found horrifying as they're going in. Like, I don't understand why there are 1,400 people in, is it the IRS, whose job it is to get computers for other people. There are 1,400 people in the I'll get you a laptop division of the IRS. Why are there 1,400 people?
Sweet gig, though.
I mean, I couldn't quite understand what was being said. It seemed to be like they changed the computers, the provisioning of the computers, and it changes, and they need other changes. There was something, it was not making logistical sense to me, but what they were claiming is these kind of gigantic internal bureaucracies that do nothing, and that they're just going to clear that brush away. The problem is, and going back to the McNamara model, as they said, like no one in the private sector would have this number of people doing that number of things for da. But the government is not the private sector. For example, the IRS is an organization that every single person in America has to deal with. There is no private sector group or business or anything that has 333 million people under its aegis. There is no private sector business that has every person over the age of 65 in its database to whom it must distribute money on a weekly basis or a bi-weekly basis. And not just over 65 people in health reasons and in social security reasons, but also people on social security disability, which is another tens of millions of people, and people on Medicaid, which is another tens of millions, and the complications of Medicaid being half paid for by the federal government and half paid for by the states. And there is no profit to be had in it. So you can't organize it on the basis of how do we do this so that there is a profit to be found, or to do it in a way that is most efficient for our company's good workings. The most important thing in Social Security is getting the check into the hand of the Social Security recipient. And this is true, Trump pushing the button, it's very fine for people to understand this, but you allow effectively for a certain level and degree of fraud in these programs, because it's the only way you can ensure that the person who needs to get the check gets the check. Like, you can do what you can to clear up the database and clean up things and make sure that checks aren't going to people who shouldn't get them, or aren't being cashed by living relatives when they're dead and all of that. But if you start tightening those controls or playing games with those controls, you will start sweeping in or bringing under the aegis people who are, just by the definition of how regulatory intensification works, you're going to start bringing in 10 million people who need their Social Security checks who aren't getting them. And that's what is not understood when I was listening to them talk, which is the federal government is not run to make a profit. It can't be. And it is a very complicated business because it involves everybody. And Tesla involves 5 million car owners, and the federal government involves 333 million people. And then whoever is like here on a green card and still pays taxes and all of that. And it's a fundamental misunderstanding. Not that I don't think that good business practices can be brought to bear on federal things, and that you shouldn't do what you can to break up and decalcify the administrative state. We've been writing about the administrative state and its evils for 15, 20 years now. It's a major issue. It's a major issue for everybody on the right who is intellectually serious. But that's not really what's going on here. They're going in, they're saying, oh my God, there are too many people working on the IRS, whatever. And there's a reason that they're there. Maybe that can all be reformed. But it's not what it can't be to make sure that the IRS turns a profit. You can lay off a department because then it's going to be really good for the stockholders and the bottom line when you go to your stockholders meeting. There is no stockholders meeting except the presidential election every 4 years.
But this is where there's an attitude clashing with the competence of actually doing what a lot of conservatives would want to see, even if they don't like Trump, they're glad to see some change in this particular arena. But there have already been stories of recent Trump appointees going into agencies, starting to do those sorts of investigations. Like, all right, where can we, cut waste? Why are there 5,000 credit cards, but we only have 2,000 employees? They're just going and starting that process. And then DOGE comes in and just cuts them off at the knees, including firing some of their IG type, employees. And so we just had the announcement yesterday that they're going to do that at HHS. So again, the slash and burn sort of approach, however nicely they're talking about it now, is very much an engineer's mindset for a problem that is a human problem. I mean, these bureaucracies are staffed with tons of people who have figured out ways around a lot of the rules and regulations, some of which lead to fraud, but others of which probably help the American citizen get through a day and, make sure they have their Social Security check. So it's interesting to me to see the slight shift in tone among the Elon Musk types. At the same time, that remember that the message Trump keeps saying from on high is punishment, revenge, vengeance. It's I'm going to go through, and anyone who's committing fraud, anyone who's here illegally, any of my enemies from previous years, I'm going to get rid of all of them. And I think that's a really energizing message when you're running for president, and it certainly won him the election and kept his base very close. But it is not a way, you can't govern that way. And our friend Yuval Levin has a wonderful piece the other day in National Review, arguing just that. Like, this is not the way to govern. Once you get the power, then you have to think about more than just revenge.
Right. One thing that Musk and one of his deputies said that they were horrified by, and that again gets to where maybe they're confused, or again the difference between running the federal government of the United States and running everything else, is Musk said, and then we discovered that the entire federal government has one checking account. And Bret Baier said, really? It has one checking. There's one checking account. There's one account. And it has about $800 billion in it at any given moment. And there's one checking account. And what the hell kind of way is that to run a government? So I was listening to this and trying to figure out what they were talking about. Because, of course, the federal government is a $4 or $5 trillion operation, and what does that mean? And there's, money comes in because they sell bonds and, the treasuries, and that goes into the treasury, whatever. And then I had been reading about Mike Johnson and John Thune trying to figure out how to do the tax and reconciliation bills. And the question of what happens, whether they could do it before the debt ceiling crisis hits. So now I'm bringing in 17 different, almost incomprehensible things. But Johnson said something interesting. He said, we're not going to know when the debt ceiling is hit until around June, because that's when we get all the money in from the 2024 taxes. So the federal government will collect or, get through the April 15th deadline and everything will be accounted for. And then by June, they will know that the pot of money that the federal government has, which is the aggregate take of the federal government from the U.S. economy, paid in the part of the U.S. economy that pays into the tax system, and they don't know how much it is. And it has to go into one account, let's say, in some fashion or other, so that that money can be pooled so that the Treasury Department can know when the federal government runs out of money. And I say this, I run a nonprofit. There are moments, I once ran a small business, same problem, like you need your receipt. It's not just what you're billing or what you expect to get. You need to get what you're going to get in if you're going to have to start paying bills out, which is what the debt ceiling is, right? We have to pay interest on our debt, and we'll run out of money to pay the interest on our debt. So that money has to be pooled and aggregated somewhere so that the Treasury Secretary can say, well, it's coming on August 11th, or you know what, we have 3 more weeks. And this has actually happened like every year. They're like, now we found some change in the couch, and we have 3 more weeks before we hit the debt ceiling. So there's a reason that account that Musk was talking about that struck him as being unbelievably dangerous or bad management or bad accounting, that wouldn't exist under any other circumstances in any other place at any other time, and has nothing to do with economic probity and good management. It has to do with the way the federal government has decided to deal with the fact that it is a net debtor institution that's largest single outlay is payments on the national debt, because we borrowed all this money and we have to meet our debt obligations. And so there is a naivete or something in the way these guys who've never worked for the government, and it's good, like, you should come in and take fresh eyes. But they didn't come in with fresh eyes. They came in with a flamethrower. And then are trying to clean up the mess afterwards or something like that.
There's something here of the Burkean, what did he say, that a liberal is walking in the field, sees a fence, and says, "Let's tear it down."
Chesterton's fence, yes.
Oh, it's Chesterton? Sorry. And the conservative says, "Hold on, maybe it's here for a reason."
Yeah.
And it's they're missing the reason. Yeah.
I mean, the problem is, I don't like big government. Right. I don't like the fact that we're a net debtor. I don't like the fact that this is the way things work. And if there were any kind of national consensus on making radical changes to it, that would be the most exciting development of my lifetime. But far from moving in that direction, which Republicans were trying to do for like 10 years, and say, we got to watch out for we're about to hit a cliff where the government...
Paul Ryan, you sweet
Paul
summer
Ryan
child.
and Yuval and everybody are like, we're going to hit we're going to hit a point at which federal outlays are larger. The demand for federal outlay, the federal obligations are larger than the money that we take in. And the government will go broke meeting the payments that are automatic. Right? Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security, and that's going to come in 2032 or 2035. And then there's going to have to either be massive slashing of benefits or massive tax increases all at once, simply to make sure that the government doesn't collapse. And everything went in the other direction. We tried to have this conversation. People were talking about it. It was sort of in the air. Obama and Ryan had a session at Camp David to have a kind of debate over it and all of that. And then Trump came in and said, I'm not cutting anything. Social Security forever. All these guys are stupid. I'm going to give everybody whatever they want and spend whatever I want. And now he's brought in Musk to sort of see if he can find change in the couch cushions. But we don't have any consensus on what I just said.
But that's also the thing, like the change in the couch cushions is an important part of this, I feel like, because the savings are not huge. And so the disproportionate chaos being caused by DOGE versus the money that they are supposedly saving, they keep revising their savings. They'll put we saved $8 quadrillion on federal tennis shoes the other day, and then it turns out they only saved $5. It's a constant it's like the economic numbers, the constant revisions, and what you're seeing is a lot of shakeup, a lot of uncertainty, right? I mean, it's not just people are like, I don't know how safe my job is, stuff like that, and we can talk about whether that's really that sympathetic a position from the perspective of the public looking at federal government workers who are protected by all these things and all that other stuff. But the larger point is that there's a swirl of chaos and nobody is actually seeing any difference at all. Like, there's no measurable savings at all. And therefore, it's unclear if anybody's going to know that DOGE was ever here, besides for all the people who are full of anxiety.
Well, and before DOGE, this is another thing about strategy. Before DOGE, federal workers were an abstraction to most Americans unless they knew one or were one. Now you have the very abstract numbers that Seth is correct to point out are constantly being revised and changed. And so people sort of tune that out as an abstraction. But all over the media, you have stories of human beings who lost their job, threats of, kids are dying of this in Africa, and we made this horrible choice. It's going to lead to
millions
our drug
of
supply
people
being
will
messed up.
die.
Like,
right?
Real
That
stories.
is,
These are human stories. People understand those as not abstractions.
Yeah.
Now they might be very biased, and I certainly think many of them have been wrong, but they are telling a story, and the other side is showing us weird spreadsheets. And that's I think why they sat down with Brett Baer last night.
right. So, all sympathy, and then they started saying numbers where I thought, okay, you know what, you've really gone in the wrong direction here. Musk said flatly that there's $500 billion a year in fraud in the federal government. I don't know where he got that number from, but again, federal budget of $4 trillion, $5 trillion. I don't even know what the federal budget is. It's $5 trillion, $6 trillion, $4 trillion. So that's like 10%, right? It's like close to what he's saying is 10% of the federal government's money is lost to fraud. It's not lost because of mismanagement. It's lost because of frauds. If that's true, and we know enough to know we can't take it at face value. So going after fraud could be a real thing. Going after the size of departments because of the size of personnel, that's not fraud. Fraud is somebody submits a voucher for something they didn't do and gets paid for it and then collects the money. That's the COVID fraud. That's the Seeds of Justice fraud in Minnesota. That's the fact that maybe what DOGE should be doing is focusing its attention on clawing back the COVID fraud, the way the Madoff special manager, or whatever his title was, spent 10 years clawing back and getting back from people who had profited from Madoff the money that Madoff had stolen from his unsuspecting, the people that he had defrauded. If there's that much fraud, and Musk could come back and say, I found $300 billion in fraud that I've returned to the federal government, that could keep Republicans in power for a generation. That's a mind-boggling amount of money. But laying off 20,000 people at HHS, it's good, it's fine, it's bad, it's good. We don't know. I mean, that's just a sort of and particularly with that psychotic running HSS, who is announcing this, who's he laying off? He's laying off everybody who is in favor of vaccines, so he can put in this guy who lost his medical license in Maryland to be the man who is the surveyor of vaccine strength. I don't trust him to be laying people off. I mean, I'm sorry he was confirmed, but now he's confirmed, but now he's gonna, without any supervision, lay off 20,000 people. He shouldn't be able to lay off his housekeeper. He and his friend, did you hear Tucker Carlson yesterday or the day before yesterday said he would never fly on a plane if he knew that the pilot had been vaccinated?
Oh, please.
Because
You know Tucker only flies private. Come on.
So he can make sure that his private pilot wasn't vaccinated? Because, the vaccine has I don't know what it is that Bill Gates's microchip could get into the mind control and then crash the plane. This is where these people are. They are in powerful positions. I thought Sam Britton at, the nuclear waste guy who was stealing luggage, he was bad. That was bad.
But he wasn't getting everybody else in the government to steal luggage.
Right. But I'm just saying, so they keep focusing on things and then everything starts going off haywire. And that's maybe where we can spend 2 minutes talking for once yet again about the signal scandal, because I've never seen anything like this. The press is treating this like everyone's going down, and it's Watergate 2.0 and all of that. And the party in power doesn't care that much. So who are they talking to? If Trump wanted to fire Waltz, he would fire Waltz. Look, Rumsfeld went to George W. Bush in 2003 or 2004 when Abu Ghraib hit and offered to resign. And Bush said, no, I don't want you to resign. I'll let you go after the election if we win. I don't need the destabilization. Trump isn't even saying that. He's like, Mike learned a lesson, whatever. And then we hear all this like, oh, everyone in the Republican Party says they screwed up and it's terrible. They screwed up and it's terrible, but they won't say it on the record. And the sort of the national security press is pulling out their hair and going crazy. And nothing is going to happen. There aren't going to be any investigatory committees. The House isn't going to convene one. The Senate's not going to convene one. When these guys come in to testify, the minority in the minority in the House and the Senate among the Democrats will yell at them and scream at them and ask them questions. And I don't know if there's any more to be gleaned from this. And the American people are getting the information they need to say the Trump people are too reckless, and Trump is just once again like running the government in a really reckless and dangerous way, and we can't trust him, or we can't trust his party. And when we have a chance, like in Pennsylvania, to vote to show some flag about where the country should go in the future in a special election, maybe we're going to say, watch out, we're going to vote for the Democrats.
The one danger here, I think, long term for Trump, shrugging and acting as if this was not a big deal, is what it means for the people who are working for these people, who work, the people who work for Hegseth, the people who Waltz is bossing around. This is a perfect example of an elite following one rule for itself and enforcing another set of rules on everyone beneath them, because we all know that if a low-level person at the Pentagon or elsewhere had done what these guys had done, they would probably be relieved of their duties. They would probably be fired, or at the very least publicly reprimanded. They would suffer consequences. And again, part of the Trump messaging was there are two tiers of justice. I'm treated one way, the Biden crime family is treated another. Well, here's an example. And again, it would have to take more than just this one little scandal. If these accumulate, though, and there seems to be one rule for himself and his appointees, and then everybody else is subjected to the rule of law, that's not going to go over well, not just with the American people who might ignore a lot of these stories, but for the people who work for this administration. I mean, has a worrisome effect, I think. If you're an employee, what are the rules now? Can you start like chatting on Signal with your friends about what you just saw in your Pentagon briefing? No, you can't. But now those other guys can do what they want.
No, I mean, I am not denying the severity of the problem. I'm saying politically, it's very interesting because we are now in a world in which there are these one-way conversations, and the one-way conversations are this is a national security disaster of historic proportions, but the people in power don't act like it is. Now, maybe that's just kind of foolishness. It's like pretending that Vietnam is going well when it's going badly, and that this is going to come back and bite you in the tush. Or it's Russiagate again, in the sense that it is people who hate Trump working themselves up into a lather and trying to figure out ways to get at him through this. And I would caution them to beware, because I'm telling you right now, it'll take 3 minutes to find out that Tony Blinken was on Signal sending heart emojis to his Chinese counterpart. I mean, there's nothing new under the sun. Did they violate OPSEC? Yeah. Was OPSEC violated during the Biden administration? It was. problem here is the devices and the fact that our behavior with these devices has outrun our capacity to control and contain ourselves. Not that there's something uniquely bad about Pete Hegseth and Mike Waltz that they don't know how to use their phones.
Then put Elon Musk on that problem. Like, build a government system that's actually secure, that's mobile, that does that.
No.
Yeah.
Well, not
Hey,
Elon
go ahead.
Musk, but like someone.
No, I mean, then
China will have
signal
it.
becomes X.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah,
not Elon Musk,
yeah.
but you know what I mean? Like, solve that.
Yeah.
That's actually a long-standing structural problem for secure communication in a mobile digital age that the government's way, way, way behind. And
But
our
I mean,
enemies
it's
are actually
doomed.
far ahead of us.
Yeah.
I just have to bring, for the sake of both sidesism here, like when you talk about how there are people, the government, the administration saying it's no big deal, and that's bad, and I agree. And I was thinking, and I know Afghanistan came up earlier this week. When the Afghanistan pullout debacle happened, not only did the administration say it's no big deal, they said this is the greatest airlift in U.S. history, and the sympathetic media celebrated with them. So this is better than that in terms of at
Well,
least
it's better than that because it wasn't a failure; it was a success. The mission wasn't compromised, and the missiles hit the Houthis. And the after effect is the problem. Like, did they blow Israeli human intelligence by Hegseth saying, we know what bedroom? I can't remember his name. The
Well,
head
they
of the
did.
Houthis.
Israel says that they did.
Right? No,
they
but I
actually,
can't remember the name
Yeah.
of the guy who was going
So what does that
around.
mean for sharing future
They're
intelligence?
gonna dare Jeffrey Goldberg to release the names of the Israeli intelligence.
Right. Yeah.
But I think that the X factor here is where the media goes with it, because right now there's like a running feud between the media and Pete Hegseth, and it's left over from the campaign because while it may feel otherwise, we've been at this administration for like 2 months. So so it's all actually very recent, and the media has taken a few different angles. One of the things that they're clearly doing is trying to find one that will upset either the administration enough to fire Hegseth or to disrupt whatever is circling the wagons around Hegseth within, to lower his support within the administration. And so they did the Israel story. And I'm not saying it's a real story. It's obviously, but I'm just saying in terms of what the media is doing, they're looking at this from a bunch of different angles. And then yesterday was also the pilots are angry. Our pilots are angry. They don't know if they can fly, whatever. And so they're saying, maybe they'll care about a military a military revolt. Maybe that will make something like that. So I think that they're going to exhaust those angles, but it feels less like Russiagate and more like this is between the media and Pete Hegseth, and it feels very, very much a target on his back specifically, in a way that the others in the chat are just simply not.
With one cautionary note there, which is that I think there are people in the military who are concerned about their safety being at risk if they're a pilot, or if they're somebody who's sent into battle on any sort of mission that requires confidentiality or secrecy, that the guy who's in charge of the Pentagon is chatting on Signal and doesn't even realize a journalist is on there. I think they see this as a lucky miss that it didn't fall into the wrong hands. And the fact that the Trump administration won't even acknowledge that. I mean, there's a sense in which if you're putting your life at risk for your country as an enlisted member of the military, you want to assume that the people in charge are not making dumb mistakes, like literally a mistake that a teenager does, on their group chat in high school.
And that's the ultimate thing that you're saying there is the problem. The problem is we're back to the can't anybody here play this game. DOGE is cutting 20,000 jobs without knowing what the jobs are. Hegseth and Waltz are doing things with chats they shouldn't be doing. One assumes that when Trump said he was only going to hire the best men back in 2015, when he said, "Oh, the best men, I'm going to hire the best men." Some of these are very impressive men. Waltz is a very impressive person with a very impressive resume. He did something unbelievably boneheaded that he's lying about. Hegseth is lying about what he did. Obviously, these are war plans. Saying they're not war plans is just like, I don't know how people lie like that. It's kind of amazing. It's like the scene in Dumbo, this movie from 1962, where Jimmy Durante is trying to take Dumbo the elephant out of the circus, and he's leading him. Dumbo is right behind him, and somebody says to Durante, "Where are you going with that elephant?" And Durante says, "What elephant?" And then he looks to his left and he looks to his right. And, the elephant is right behind him. I mean, you can't say that you didn't release the war plans when we can see right there that you released the war plans.
By the way, I have to say that's the amazing thing about how a lot of the right-wing media is treating this.
Yeah,
is they're saying, who are you going to believe? A liberal journalist, Jeffrey Goldberg, who hates the Trump administration, or this very serious national security team. I mean, come on. It's not a question of who you're going to believe. It's there. It's there. Right. This is not. There aren't two competing versions of something that no one witnessed. We're all witnesses. We're all witnesses to it.
And I'm glad you brought this up.
Because, who are you going to believe, Jeffrey Goldberg or your lying eyes?
Right. But you bring this up because there is an area in which I do not believe the reporting, and that I am willing to give the administration the benefit of the doubt on. And that is the horror story reporting about the deportations. Do I believe that one or two or three people might have gotten swept up in the Tren de Aragua deportations? I do. I would wonder why that person was like in the room when the ICE came in. It was just hanging out with the Tren de Aragua people when they swept them up. Do I believe that could happen? Yes. Do I think that that's a crime? Yes. Do I believe probably they should have followed a different due process system? I suppose, although I don't know how you roll up a mob without a surprise effect or whatever. Okay. I don't believe that the State Department, in the person of Marco Rubio, is violating the rights of people, and that someone was just deported because she wrote an op-ed hostile to Israel. And I am not going to accept the talk of this pro-terrorist bar and its lawyers and the people who have been trained to be its lawyers. I will give the State Department and Marco Rubio the benefit of the doubt over them, because they're showing me nothing except they're whining. And I do not believe that Mahmoud Khalil is innocent, and I do not believe that those people. Do I think it's not I'm not competent to judge what exactly the due process provisions here how they would come into conflict with the National Security Act of 1952. It's not really my job, but there are horror stories I'm going to believe, and there are horror stories I'm not going to believe. And this is one I'm choosing based on the behavior of liberal journalists and the people that they are married to and that they listen to and that they went to college with and that they have brunch with and that they, and that they go to help them negotiate their wills and whatever. I am not going to trust. They're simply taking whatever is being thrown in their ear and saying, look at this authoritarian, monstrous administration, and it's trampling on the due process rights of people who are not Americans, who do not have a right to be in the United States, and who they have isolated on and said, we're going to deport so-and-so. There's got to be reasons, and maybe those reasons are classified. Well, maybe they've been picked. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say that there have been a couple of cases where the immediate, supporting your argument, which I think is correct, that the immediate media reaction is another example of Trump being an authoritarian, sweeping people off the street, shoving them into a paneled van, and you never hear from them again. Their lawyer can't locate them. There was a case recently of a woman who was described in the press as a Russian dissident, and she was coming back from a conference, and she's a scientist, and then she was denied entry, and they're going to ship her back to Russia, and there she will die. I read this initially. I thought, well, that sounds terrible. And then you just spend, half a day, and another little bubble of information comes up, which says, well, actually, she was trying to smuggle frog embryos into the United States in some effort to, bring it. This is something that's obviously, there's all kinds of restrictions about what you can bring into the country after you've left and come back. And particularly so if you're here on a visa, where you don't have the same sort of expectation as a citizen. And so, they're like, no, you can't come in here with these frog embryos. You're not allowed to have those. And so it was actually a very basic story. People get turned away at customs for those reasons all the time. I was on an international flight recently, and there were this couple with a massive number of suitcases. And I was like, oh, they're not getting through. And sure enough, off they took them to that little mirrored room in Dulles and never to be seen again. But they were, so we have processes for these. But the problem is the media assumes it's the authoritarian story every time.
So all these stories are coming up now on X constantly, right? There was that one. There's the Tufts op-ed writer who was supposedly being deported just for writing that. And everyone's reacting, including a lot of conservatives who want to seem, who are not Trumpy, and they want to be reasonable, and they're all immediately expressing their outrage. And I'm thinking, Covington. This reminds me of the Nick Sandmann video, right? Where you see that, then everyone's first reaction to this.
Let's remind people what that was. So there was a pro-life demonstration, right? Wasn't a pro-life demonstration? And Nick Sandmann is a high school student.
He was a high school student.
Yeah.
They were wearing MAGA hats.
There was a guy drumming. There was a Native American.
Oh, no, he's not just a peaceful Native American. He's a known obnoxious activist who's always popping up and trying to infiltrate other people's, peaceful demonstrations.
Yeah.
He's a menace.
There were all sorts of people on the scene that you couldn't see from this clip.
Right. So there was an angle that showed
the black Hebrew Israelites on the corner shouting at them that were in none of the pictures.
That showed Nick Sandmann smirking at the guy with the drum,
who was yelling at him, who was in his face screaming,
was smirking.
Yeah, well, he was angry.
He was smirking. Right. He didn't hit him with a stick. He didn't throw him into the path of a car. He was smirking at him. People went on Twitter and said, I'd like to punch that smirk off his face.
Punchable face.
Who is this kid? He should be killed. Yeah. All of that. And it turned out that the video had been selectively edited. Nick Sandmann is richer to the tune of 8 figures, I believe, probably, in terms of the settlements that he got from CNN and others that are
Washington Post, wasn't it? I don't remember.
Washington Post.
I'd like to give an example of what we're talking about here in the context of these deportations. Right? There's a guy named Mamadou Tal who was at Cornell on a visa, and he was an instigator. He celebrated the October 7th, 2023 attacks. He was an instigator on campus. He was at one point suspended for his activities. And so it became clear that when the Trump administration came in and were going to be doing these deportations, that they were serious about it. Mamadou Tal was going to be near the top of that list. He was a big fat target. He was just one of those guys who was loud and brash and made himself seen being disruptive. And he fit all the categories and was here on a student visa. He sued the administration to prevent his own deportation before the deportation proceedings actually began. In other words, he tried to preempt his own deportation by suing the administration to block the executive orders that Trump signed that have anything to do with the immigration. One of them was Trump's executive order on combating anti-Semitism. So Mamadou Tal, who had, led these protests, celebrated Hamas, all this stuff, got suspended for all this stuff, sued to block the executive order combating anti-Semitism on campuses and stuff like that. This was an extraordinarily chutzpahdik move that you almost had to admire, but it's obviously insane to sympathize with somebody who understands that he is going to be deported and therefore tries to sue an executive order that has nothing, that doesn't set any new rules or laws. Now, it turned out that his visa had been revoked, I believe, the day before he filed the lawsuit. So we're talking about a guy who's like, the Trump administration went through the normal process. They revoked the guy's visa. The next day he sues them to block an executive order on anti-Semitism because it discusses the possibility of deporting people. And the media responded by reporting that this guy was being targeted for retaliation, that he's being deported because he sued the Trump administration. And what happened was, as I said, his visa was revoked the day before.
Reverse,
but the reporting was, oh my God,
right.
What kind of fascist state are we living in, where if you sue the Trump administration over an executive order, he's going to deport you? When, of course, the events were in the entire opposite order, and the Trump administration, in this case, had its T's crossed and its I's dotted completely. And there, one sense of frustration from this is that the administration didn't even say that. Like, I'm saying that here because I wrote about the case and, whatever. Yeah. And some other people are saying, but like, there's nobody from the administration saying that until they have to respond in court. So if you pay attention to court filings, it's like, oh, the visa was revoked the day before. The administration, they tell the judge that, but there's no one messaging that to the public. And so all you hear is this guy sued the Trump administration and now he's being deported for suing them.
I can explain that because their political interests are now in conflict with the interest of, say, people like us who would really like a kind of ballast for our efforts to defend them if they are behaving in ways that require a defense, which is they think that it is a winning item for them to say, yeah, we're deporting Tren de Aragua and we're going to do it again and we're going to keep doing it. And you guys cry tears, lib. Go ahead, cry. Everybody in America knows these guys are the worst people in the world. And you know what? Even though they don't say this implicitly, if 5 or 10 people, are dragged in unfairly, that's really too bad. But the security of the country requires it. And this sometimes happens in criminal justice where people get, it's terrible. Oh, but cry. You go cry and tell us that because of that, we shouldn't be doing this. Now, it's not a great argument as a matter of law or as a matter of helping us with debating points. Is it a great populist argument, law and order versus Democrats being on the side of terrorists and criminals? It sure is. So they actually don't have an incentive to do what you want them to do, which is say, we're being careful, we're dotting our I's, we're crossing our T's, you're wrong, and, we're going to wait to see what happens in court, and we'll see the cases dismissed and all of that. They actually want to use these controversies as a political accelerant to their benefit. And as opposed to the DOGE stuff, which I think is starting to backfire on them, I think they have a lot of rope. They have a lot of string to play out here in their favor. And that the media blind spot is not understanding what it looks like when they say, this is the worst thing I've ever seen. These people are in El Salvador and they shouldn't be in El Salvador. They're Venezuelan. It's like, okay, congratulations on missing the point if you're trying to win a political war against your foe. Like,
I don't know. I don't know.
What do you mean?
I agree with you that that's what they're doing, and that's the idea.
Yeah.
I do think the media gets a hold of a handful of cases that the administration truly screwed up, and they're genuine sob stories, and they might be.
Yeah.
It's bad. It is bad. It changes the framing.
I don't know that it changes the framing. That's what I'm saying. Because again, high crime, when you're in a high crime atmosphere, if that's what people believe, and the story is the cops went too far and did X, Y, and Z, the public doesn't care.
Yes, they do. I mean, look how the public shifts whenever there was a high profile NYPD or LAPD abuse case, like the whole country's mood on the police, would sway.
Yeah, it depends on what time you're talking about. In the 1970s and in 1985, all of New York celebrated when a guy took out a gun and shot 4 people on a subway train. That's what I mean. Like, things you're not supposed to like or want, people start making allowances for if they feel like they're being directly threatened.
But I think what people like is is Homans, isn't that, yeah, Tom Homans,
Tom Homan.
saying one thing he can do is point to local officials and say, they are literally not letting us do our jobs and getting these criminals off the street. We have to just
Right.
go in and raid and sweep them all up because they are actively working against us. They're being told by their mayors. The police force is told not to help us, in fact, to shield these people. The liberal judges are doing, and actually that's been happening for a long time. That's at least a message that doesn't have to get into the details of justifying each individual deportation, but does,
Right.
again, speak to people's totally valid concern about how the system has completely protected illegal and often criminal elements under Biden. But he's kind of disappeared and said, why do I have to keep seeing Ice Barbie Kristi Noem with her expensive watches and standing in front of prisons? I don't want to see that. I'm actually on board with a lot of their policies. I am sick of that. But the optics of
the
that,
one thing
Trump
is,
loves.
right, yesterday, Marco Rubio, who is a very good politician, people should remember, he is a very good politician. He may not have won the presidency, but he is a superb politician, came out and did exactly what you're saying. He said, yeah, I deported the woman from Tufts. We've deported more than 300 people here from state. Yeah. We've done it. We're going to do more of it. And don't think that you're going to intimidate me out of doing it. We're doing it. We're doing it properly and in within the bounds of the law. And go ahead, come at me. Like, trust me, I know I'm right and we're doing the right thing. Now, that doesn't sort of like make the calm down. We're all being calm. That's sort of in the middle there. But yeah, I see. I think Homan kind of looks like a goon myself when he goes on TV. Rubio is a better spokesman for this because
I like them both for different reasons.
Okay,
though.
Okay. But anyway, I just think it's an interesting. When the principal isn't worried, meaning when Trump isn't worried, when the LA cops get into trouble because of the Rampart scandal, or stuff happens in New York because of cops, a lot depends on how the senior management reacts. They go, oh, nothing to do with this. We're going to form a commission and we're going to try to get to the bottom of this because it's all very scary and we're so worried and we'll never let it happen again. Or are you Rudy Giuliani in the mid 90s and say, I'm with the cops? I'm with the cops. All right, you want to tell me so and thus and such happened? It didn't hurt him politically. Even, there were like 3 bad, really, really bad police cases in the 1990s under Giuliani's, there was the Amadou Diallo case. There was the case of the guy on 39th and 8th. I can't remember the 3 cases specifically. And Rudy's general opinion was, we are not stopping with our aggressive efforts to make the people of New York City safe. And we're not going to join you jackals in turning and saying that the cops are bad. The cops are good. The cops are our front line. The cops are the best thing that ever happened to you. And I'm not listening to all of these people. And it politically was successful because that's what people wanted. If they hadn't wanted it, wouldn't have been successful. And I think, if you take the LA example, a lot of people in LA thought the LA cops were bad already and not just activists. Like, ordinary LA people dealing with the LA Police Department thought that they were incompetent and lousy, and it took them 4 hours to show up at your house if you told them that there was a crime that had been committed and stuff like that. And so the LA police chief, Daryl Gates, during the Rodney King stuff, was an out of touch, bad spokesman for his department and sort of like was totally cashiered as a result. So it all depends on what the situation is. But I think they think it's a winning issue for them. Maybe you're right, Abe, that it won't be and that it'll take a turn.
No, I mean, in general, John, I'm with you on giving the administration the benefit of the doubt. But I'm open to the possibility that they are making some major screw ups somewhere that could be exploited.
They can, and they are certainly making major screw ups. Yeah. I'm being cynical in talking about this as a matter strictly of how the American people will react, and will they be sad to hear that there were people swept up in a dragnet? I think so, but what if the people swept up in a dragnet, were citizens and they had their rights, and their rights were trampled on because they should have had a due process hearing, unlike the illegals who don't need a due process or whatever. But they were still in an apartment, like smoking fentanyl, doing fentanyl with the had people in Nicaragua. There's a reason they were they were thrown into the back of the truck.
Yeah, that I agree. If that's the case,
Okay.
that's not going to do it. If it's something like just grossly unjust, maybe with some video in it, then we got a situation.
No, fair enough.
Yeah.
Look, anything can happen, and I'm not denying it. I'm just saying, and in this case, when I say that I give them the benefit, I'm not even particularly saying I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt on the Nicaragua stuff necessarily. That's a law enforcement. That's actually sort of like when law enforcement do dragnets and they do stop and frisks, or they do, everybody's getting stopped to be breathalyzed or something like that. People get very pissed off, and it's really not fair. And, stuff like that always ends up being people being accused of abuse when you tighten and all of that. I'm now really talking about the visa stuff and the deportations of the terrorism supporters. And I see absolutely no reason to believe a single word that is being said by their lawyers. That is a bar that exists and has existed in this country for 30 years to defend terrorists on American soil. And there are dozens of them, and a lot of them are being trained at this place at City College in New York called CLEAR. And there are programs to fund them through the Open Society Institute. And this entire bar exists as a construct to do what they are now doing. It's almost as though the ducks were set in a row so that if there was going to be a Hamas attack on October 7th, and there were going to be campus protests and stopping things in the street and all that beginning on October 8th, that there were going to be a phalanx of lawyers ready when the federal government woke up and decided to take this seriously and started to go after them with the modality that is the easiest and cleanest, which is revoking their visas and sending them home. It's just too quick, too fast, too well organized for it to be happenstance. It's not like there's that guy in a room in a schleppy guy in an office in Brooklyn, and someone calls and says, "Please, my husband has been taken into custody. I can't find a lawyer who will take care of him. Please, mister." And then he has a whole redemption arc and, saves him. And then he's married. He stops being a drunk and he saves his marriage. And Denzel Washington plays him and wins an Oscar. That's not what's happening here. This is a organized effort on the part of a deliberately designed sub part of the New York State Bar that is at work here. Quick announcement before we go. We are going to reinstitute the Ask the Commentary podcast feature that we have done intermittently, but we're going to try to do it every week on Fridays. Ask us questions. We'll try to answer them. You can send your questions to podcast@commentary.org. Ask us about, what kind of...
Do we have Nicaragua tattoos or?
I don't know what. You can ask us anything. We're only going to be able to take 2 or 3 questions a show. So, but happy to hear from you. Love to engage with you, and thank everybody for your continued listenership. So, and have a wonderful weekend and enjoy the new baseball season. Until Monday, for Christine, Seth, and Abe, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.